Imagine streets covered in sand, silence so thick you could cut it with a knife.
Oh, wow.
All because a queen's about to give birth, and the whole nation's holding its breath, hoping, praying that it'll be a boy.
Yeah.
It's 1886, Madrid, and that baby, if he is a boy, is Alfonso XIII. Talk about pressure.
Absolutely.
Today, we're diving into his life using this Noble Blood podcast.
Oh, I like that one.
It's amazing how relevant it still feels, especially for those of us, who remember the Cold War,
Yeah.
all that tension, the world changing so fast. Alfonso had to deal with that too, ideological clashes, clinging to tradition when everything's in flux. It's a fascinating story.
It really is. And it's amazing how much his birth was seen as like this huge event, almost, religious.
I know, right?
It says a lot about the state of Spain back then. They were desperate for a male heir.
Why, though? Was it just tradition?
It was more about stability, or the lack of it.
Okay.
See, Spain had been through decades of turmoil. Remember Queen Isabella II?
Alfonso's grandmother.
Right. About 50 years before Alfonso was born, she tried to, modernize Spain.
Modernize how?
Separate church and state, constitutional monarchy, all that. But it backfired big time.
Oh.
Conservative forces, especially this group called the Carlists,
I've heard that name.
they were all about tradition.
Okay.
They hated the changes. So they pushed back hard. Isabella ended up exiled.
Wow.
It triggered these Carlist wars, years of fighting, chaos. Even after the monarchy was restored with Alfonso XII, Alfonso XIII's father, things were still really fragile.
And he died young. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Leaving a pregnant queen and a nation teetering on the edge. So you can see why they pinned all their hopes on this baby.
Yeah.
He was supposed to be their savior.
Unify a fractured Spain.
Exactly.
Almost like Shakespearean. All this drama right from the start.
Right.
But the podcast also talks about his upbringing, which sounds pretty wild.
Oh, yeah.
This mix of crazy luxury and hardcore military training.
It's fascinating. On one hand, he's the happiest and best-loved king. Pampered, indulged,
Spoiled rotten.
pretty much.
Wow.
There's this story about his aunt, Isabel. She made this rule everyone had to do whatever the king said, like anything.
Really? Even if it was ridiculous.
Apparently.
Talk about setting him up for a reality check later on.
I know, right?
I mean, were they preparing him to rule or just turning him into some kind of mythical figure?
And then contrast that with the discipline. He was up before dawn every day. Intense studies, military drills, even fencing with Winston Churchill when they were kids.
No way.
They were trying to mold him into this, warrior king image, like something out of Spain's glorious past.
It's like they were trying to fit him into this mold that maybe didn't even suit him.
Yeah. It makes you wonder how all that affected him, in the long run.
How it shaped his whole reign.
Yeah.
Speaking of shaping, let's talk about his marriage to Ina.
Victoria Eugenia. She wasn't exactly thrilled about joining the Spanish court,
It doesn't sound like the most welcoming place.
It wasn't just the court. I mean, she wasn't that into Alfonso either.
Really?
And she found the whole scene kind of backward. No fancy hotels for her wedding guests, a cold palace.
Oh, no.
And the spitting, that didn't help.
I can imagine. Total culture shock.
Totally. The marriage was more about politics,
Makes sense. Alliance, all that.
Alfonso wanted to modernize the monarchy's image, and marrying a British princess was a good way to do that. But then, the wedding day, it took a dark turn.
The bombing.
Yeah. It was a huge reminder of all the unrest brewing under the surface.
Hard to imagine something so awful happening on your wedding day.
They were in the carriage, waving to the crowds, then boom, this explosion.
Caught on film, too, right?
Yeah. It's chilling. They were lucky to be alive, but it definitely left scars.
I bet. And then on top of that, the hemophilia issue.
Tragic. Ina was a carrier, and it affected their kids.
How did Alfonso take that?
Not well. He blamed Ina, even though he knew the risks.
Oh, wow.
He saw it as a threat to the dynasty.
More important than his own family's well-being.
Sadly, yeah. It really shows how personal things were tied up in the whole political mess.
Yeah. Even the royal family was fractured, mirroring the country.
Exactly.
So let's talk about Alfonso's political career. Did he actually live up to the Great Hope label?
That's where it gets tricky. He could have been a reformer, embrace the progressive ideas that were floating around.
Not.
He clung to the past, wanted to hold on to power the old way.
The podcast mentions the Moroccan War. What was his role in that?
Spain was losing its empire bit by bit. Alfonso saw the war as a chance to show some strength.
But it was a disaster, right?
Oh, yeah. Thousands of Spanish soldiers died, and Alfonso's response was, well, not great.
The Goosebumps quote.
That one. Talk about tone deaf.
He cared more about looking strong than the human cost.
It seems that way.
And this all leads into the rise of dictators in Spain, right? His attempts to control everything backfired.
It's ironic. Trying to create stability, he actually made things worse. Opened the door for someone like Primo de Rivera to take over.
Who was basically a dictator.
Pretty much. And Alfonso actually admired him.
No way.
Compared him to Mussolini even. Thought it was a good thing for Spain.
He was aligning himself with dictators while democracy was falling apart.
He valued order above all else. Probably scared of losing control.
So by the time the 1931 referendum happened, was the monarchy already finished?
Pretty much. People were tired of the instability, the economic struggles, the silence. They voted for a republic.
Overwhelmingly right.
Yeah. It was the end for Alfonso. Exiled, separated from his wife, he went from great hope to a relic of the past.
What a fall. So did he pave the way for Franco? Was he part of Spain's slide into fascism?
The podcast says he was more of a pawn than a player. Franco used the monarchy's image to make himself look legitimate.
Even in exile, Alfonso was being used.
It shows how easily history gets rewritten. Makes you wonder how much control anyone really has.
Heady stuff. But then the podcast throws in this story about Ratoncito Perez.
And that tooth mouse.
Yeah. Seems out of place after all that. It did, though. At first, I was like, what's with the tooth fairy story?
Right.
But it actually makes a lot of sense.
It's this glimpse into a different side of Alfonso's world. This story, it was actually made up for him.
Coolly.
By his mom, Maria Cristina, to, like, celebrate him losing his first tooth.
Oh, that's kind of sweet.
Yeah.
But there's more to it, right?
Oh, definitely. The author, this guy, Luis Coloma, he was pretty clever. He used the story to kind of critique the elite.
Sneak in a little social commentary.
Exactly. It's like he was telling Alfonso, hey, you have power. Use it to help everyone, not just the rich folks.
Even a kid's story has layers.
Right. It shows how much pressure Alfonso was under, even as a kid.
To be a good king, to make a difference.
Yeah. And it makes you think, what if he had followed that path?
Instead of getting caught up in, the whole monarchy thing.
It's a mixed legacy. Do-nothing king, some people say. But was it all his fault? Or was he just dealt a bad hand?
A product of his time.
Yeah. It depends on what you choose to focus on, I guess.
There's probably truth to both sides. He had huge expectations, but he also made choices. Choices that affected Spain in a big way.
It's not just about one king, though. It's about how much power individuals really have.
To shape history.
Yeah. Against all the forces pushing and pulling.
Could Alfonso have changed things? Prevented fascism? Or was it just inevitable?
Big questions. And history keeps debating them. But that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not just facts and dates.
It's about people. Choices.
Yeah.
The struggle between tradition and change.
Exactly. And by looking at these stories, we learn about ourselves, about power, about progress.
And how messy it all can be.
Right.
Well, that was a trip. Alfonso XIII, A Life of Contradictions.
Absolutely.
If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to subscribe. We'll have more fascinating stories, more history coming up.